Thank you very much, and thank you for the business contributors to a very interesting start of the day. It gave a good background for the discussions, to hear the perspectives both from large business and from SMEs and micro business, which is very important. So in my presentation here now, I will present the essence of our reform proposals concerning business. Before I do that, I will say before I go into the proposals themselves, I will say something about why we think it is necessary to have a legislative reform here. Because even though I'm a law professor, I am not like a carpenter with a hammer. I don't think that everything is a nail and needs to be hammered. Indeed, I think that that a lot of the business reaction to proposals for legislative reforms, negative reactions to that are very understandable, because there has been a lot of bad legislation, a lot of legislation that has been to show that policymakers are doing something and which has meant bureaucratic efforts for companies that try to comply and not affected companies that don't. So it is only because we think it is necessary that we propose legislative reforms, and I will explain why and the contents of those. The starting point is that we have seen that a main barrier to sustainability is this social norm of shareholder primacy, this perception that the purpose of business and the duty of decision makers in businesses is to maximize returns for shareholders. This is not in the law. And in the previous large project that we had, Sustainable Companies, we undertook an analysis of many jurisdictions all over the world to find out what company law actually says, and to find out what the scope is to integrate sustainability more into business. And we found out that the scope was surprisingly large, because it is just a legal myth that company law requires businesses to maximize returns for investors. Company law gives scope to the decision makers to find out how to run businesses in what they perceive is the best way. And of course, the underlying assumption when legislators, when countries around the world have allowed business to use the legal forms that are available and operate in the way that they do, is that this would be good for businesses, good for workplaces, good for society. That's the starting point. And then something has gone very wrong. And the short form for the something that has gone very wrong is shareholder primacy. We found that this social norm has taken over the space that company law gives the decision makers to decide how businesses should be run. And we found out that this is exacerbated through corporate groups and through the use of global value chains, which fragments even further the responsibility of the societal and environmental and broader economic costs of the way that businesses operate. We also found that the reporting regimes have not worked as intended for several reasons, including weak formulation of rules and lack of enforcement. So that was in the Sustainable Companies project. In the SMART project, where we took a much broader perspective to the regulation that we assessed, we still found that this shareholder primacy is a main barrier. And it has been increasingly recognized that that is the case. But that it is increasingly recognized and called out hasn't still changed its power. We see that there are increasingly competing social norms, and there are various sets of initiatives from the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights to Global Compact, OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and a change in society's perception of what business should be about. But in this clash of norms, shareholder primacy still wins out. And when we say that shareholder primacy is such a barrier, we use it as a short form for a mix of economic incentives and market pressure that is directly relevant to the large corporations with shares listed on stock exchanges, but it has knock-on effect on the rest of the business world. And in parallel with the work that we did in the SMART project, we have also undertaken what has become a project in its own right, the Cambridge Handbook project, which shows the state of the art across jurisdictions all over the world. And in spite of the fact that there are, as we also heard from previous commentators, that there are legislative attempts in some countries to change this, it isn't enough to mitigate the shareholder primacy norm. Therefore, we need to change this. And there is one thing that gives me hope, that we will see change in spite of the fact that we have different perceptions of what is important and what should be the purpose of business and what is the best way to run business. Because even if one takes quite a conservative view of what business is about, and even if you think that it isn't the responsibility of business to think about such abstract concepts as planetary boundaries or poor children in mining communities and so on, it doesn't matter. That discussion, we don't even have to have that discussion, because the financial risks in the traditional conservative sense, the impact on the profitability of business is impacted by the growing unsustainability of the economic activities that we have today. So even if you don't care about the planet or people, even if you think that, okay, my job is to make sure that my business makes money, then you actually have to care about the financial risks of unsustainability. And that is why we think that it is possible to propose and actually eventually see adopted a company law reform, which we think is necessary to redefine the purpose of the company, to set the record straight. It is not about maximizing returns for shareholders. That is bad for everybody to act like that is the goal, even for the shareholders, because of the financial risks of unsustainability and because many shareholders don't have such a short-term narrow perspective. And to make sure that that isn't just a showcase legislation which leads to box ticking and greenwashing and SDG washing, we also need to redefine the duties of the board. And through that, redefine what counts. And what counts is much more than returns to shareholders. And to make sure that this is taken seriously, we actually have to use a new kind of language in legislation, because just leaving it open or clarifying that businesses should take into account various interests, like they already have tried in some countries, isn't enough. So we have to be clear. So we suggest that the EU's Company Law Directive of 2017 should be reformed to set out that the overarching purpose of an undertaking is to create value in a sustainable way within planetary boundaries. And to make sure that that is followed up properly, we also suggest to redefine the duties of the board. And that detailed proposal can be summarized in 3 points. First, the board must commit to achieving this, to contribute to achieving this overarching purpose. And to do that, it must make sure that the purpose is of sustainable value creation within planetary boundaries is integrated throughout the business. And I say business and not company, because it is not just about the legal entity. It is about the whole corporate group if you're a parent company, or it is about the global value chains if you're a lead company. And if you're a little company or a little undertaking somewhere in this, then maybe your job will be to feed that information to the lead company so that the lead company can take the full responsibility. But regardless, this needs to be integrated throughout, and that involves assessing and probably changing somewhat the business model. It involves integrating this into risk management. Remember the financial risks of unsustainability. And to ensure that this is done properly, we suggest stringent sustainability assessment, which entails sustainability due diligence. So not just human rights due diligence, or not just disclosure of climate change efforts, but full sustainability due diligence. And based on that, to identify the negative impacts and the principal risks of negative impacts, and make a plan for an ambitious plan for a continuous improvement process. And to assure that that actually happens, and that the competitive advantage is given to businesses that work to transition to sustainability, to make sure that there is a level playing field for European businesses that want to be a part of the transition to sustainability. We must have an external assurance of these systems and processes to make sure that they are carried out in a way that includes open and participatory processes with affected communities, and that the relevant issues are identified. And lastly, we will then have reporting that actually makes sense, because we will know which issues the business is to report on, and then that reporting, including these issues in the management report, must be audited. Because it is time that we take people and the humanity as seriously as we have taken financial issues for centuries. And if you don't think that that sounds like a good slogan, then just remember the financial risks of unsustainability means that you actually have to. Thank you.